Two Falcons are headed to the Pro Bowl. One absolutely deserves it. The other one, not so much.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy. And today's Locked On Falcons is sponsored by Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code Locked On NFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. If you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. In today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we will be reviewing the All-22 from the Falcons' Week 16 win over the Arizona Cardinals. We'll be talking about the woes behind the Falcons' short-yardage issues, as well as who won the battle for CB2 between CJ Henderson and Kobe Bryant, and what that position could look like in the future between those two guys. But we'll start today's episode talking about the big news of the day, which is that the Pro Bowl rosters were announced for both the AFC and NFC for the upcoming Pro Bowl games later in 2026. And the Falcons had 2 players make it to the Pro Bowl. Bijan Robinson, their running back, making it his 2nd straight Pro Bowl, and Chris Lindstrom, his 4th straight Pro Bowl. Now, Bijan, I think, is more than well-deserved. As we mentioned on Sunday, after his performance against the Cardinals, he became the 3rd Falcon ever to hit 2,000 scrimmage yards, with joining the club set by Jamal Anderson in 1998, as well as William Andrews did it twice in 1981 and I believe 1983. But Bijan is currently on pace to set the record for the most scrimmage yards for a Falcons player in team history. Andrews, I believe in 83, set the record at 2,176 yards, and Bijan's about 151 scrimmage yards, combining rushing and receiving yards, away from setting that franchise record, which he could, in theory, get this next coming week against the Rams. He's averaging about 135 per game and has 2 games left, so has plenty of opportunity that, if he hits his current pace of 2,296, I believe that will be 12th all-time among all players in NFL history, right behind Edgerrin James, who had 2,303 back in, I believe, 2000. And I only mention that just because Edgerrin James was my ceiling comp for Bijan Robinson. So in theory, Bijan's already hit the ceiling, his ceiling of Edgerrin James this season. Now, the record on scrimmage yards was set by Chris Johnson, CJ2K, with 25.09 back in the day in his 2000 season. So Bijan, very well deserving of this Pro Bowl. Last year, he got in as an alternate. This year, straight up. And I think we'll continue to see Bijan, add more Pro Bowls to his belt, more notches in his belt as his career goes forward. Now, the player that I thought was less deserving was Chris Lindstrom. As I stated last week when we talked about the players that I thought were deserving of making the Pro Bowl on the final day of fan voting, which I believe was last Tuesday, I didn't think Chris Lindstrom has played at his usual Pro Bowl level. I think he was more than deserving the last 3 years, but this year less so. And I think part of that is owed to injuries. Some of that's owed to not having Kaleb McGary as well. And, I can't sit here and say like, oh, they should have put Landon Dickerson or, Steve Avila or somebody like that over Chris Lindstrom, because I haven't watched enough of those guys to know if they are more deserving of a Pro Bowl. But it's just kind of like, to me, this was been more of a 7 out of 10 season for Chris Lindstrom than like the 8 or 9 out of 10 season that he's had in the past, is basically what I'm getting at. Now, you hear me say that and you're like, that's a crazy statement, Aaron, because he's still the number 2 highest graded guard for Pro Football Focus, only behind Denver Broncos guard Quinn Miners. And we've talked about this in the past. We talked about this, I believe, back in like 22 or 23 with PFF's grading system. It's kind of a quirk of PFF's grading system that basically in their grading system, zone blocks get graded higher than gap blocks, so to speak. right? Due to the degree of difficulty. And because the Falcons run so much zone blocking, their offensive linemen tend to grade very high in PFF system. It's why they always have extremely high run blocking grades. It's why, the Falcons have had 4 different starting centers over the last, 6 years, 5 years. And each one of them have graded out as a top 5 run blocker: Matt Hennessy, Drew Dahlman, and Ryan Nuzul. But it's not because all of them are equally elite run blockers. It's just the quirk of their grading system. And so that to me is a big reason why Lindstrom continues to grade very, very highly for PFF. But, to be clear, I think Lindstrom's still an excellent player. He's one of the best outside zone run blockers, period, not just guards, but offensive linemen, period, in the NFL. I just don't think we've seen that version of Lindstrom as much this year as we have seen in previous years. And so that's why I say he's less deserving, but I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, like he shouldn't have made the Pro Bowl. It's just like, oh, okay. Like you can have a down year and still get it in. And for the most part, because he wasn't a top 10 guy in the fan voting, it was because, the players and coaches got him in, and they account for 2/3 of the vote. So he still has the respect of his peers and obviously coaches in there. And I'm sure plenty of people will be like, well, the coaches and the players know better. And it's like, have you seen the NFL top 100? I don't think the players know better. We'll give the coaches the benefit of the doubt. But, in addition to those 2 guys making the Pro Bowl, Kyle Pitts, AJ Terrell are going to be alternates. So we'll see if certain players skip the Pro Bowl because they make the Super Bowl or due to injuries, and those guys will get an opportunity to get there. Pitts obviously went to the Pro Bowl his rookie year. So this will be his second, and this will be AJ Terrell's first, potentially, if he finds a way. I think he's like the number 4 alternate. So a lot of guys got to sit out for AJ to get there. But, one day we'll get there with AJ. One day. But, as I stated last week, Bijan was the one guy that I would pound the table for to make the Pro Bowl. Chris Lindstrom, I wouldn't pound the table for him, but I expected him to make the Pro Bowl, based off of what I talked about last week. And Pitts, Terrell, and Drake London were probably the other top 3 guys that I think you could make a pretty compelling case for to make the Pro Bowl. And obviously Pitts and Terrell were able to get there as alternates, and Drake not so much, but injuries and whatnot. So we will move on from the Pro Bowl conversation and get into the all 22 of the Arizona Cardinals game. And I want to talk about the Falcons' short yardage issues because we're talking about Chris Lindstrom and the blocking already with the Pro Bowl stuff. Let's get more into that and why the Falcons continue to struggle in short yardage throughout this game against the Cardinals and throughout the years as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, with the holiday season being the best time for sports, whether we're talking bowl games, college playoffs, NFL playoffs, basketball, pro and college. It's all happening right now. And, you're making choices every single day. And one of the best places to make the right choices is Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the easiest way to get in on daily fantasy. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections. You can lock in your lineup and you're in the game. And creating a lineup takes less than 60 seconds. And the app makes the whole process smooth and intuitive. You can choose from a huge range of unique stats like yards, fantasy score, field goals attempted, free throws made, turnovers, whatever fits your strategy. It's simple, fast, and available in 45 states, including California, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. Prize Picks, it's good to be right. So I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. We call you the everydayers, and you are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And if you want to level up your everydayness, why not join the Everydayer Club, right? At the link in the description below. For $5 a month, $50 a year, you can get, exclusive perks like an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, right? Discord access for the Locked On Podcast Network, merch store, as well as other perks. And again, you can find that at the link in the description at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So getting into the all 22, one of the big issues, obviously the Falcons, I thought, played a good game overall, but there's a couple of issues in this game that we're going to focus on, mostly not because negativity, but just because like this allows us to have more conversations about the future of this team, obviously, because we know that, this season is kind of lost. And so short yardage was one of those issues that showed up in this Cardinals game, where the Falcons were 5 of 10 in short yardage situations, where, they had 2 or less yards to go. But you could also include a 3rd and 3 that they had late in the third quarter where they were in 4 down territory, where they also ran the football, and I believe failed to convert on that particular play. And then you base it off of like what the league average is, about 70%. The Falcons should have converted about 2 more short yardage situations than they did in this game. And you could very easily cherry pick the 2 late game short yardage situations that they did not convert, right? Where the Falcons were trying to ice the game in with 2 minutes left in the game, a little more than 2 minutes left in the game, and ran it on 2 consecutive short yardage situations, a 3rd and 2 and a 4th and 1. On the 3rd and 2, they ran an outside zone run play to Bijan. He couldn't convert due to a free runner off the backside. And then on the 4th and 1, the Falcons went with their unbalanced formation, tried to run behind Jake Matthews and Elijah Wilkinson, and neither one of those guys were able to win their blocks, and it led to Tyler Allgeier getting stopped short of gaining the yards. And for those of you not familiar with what an unbalanced line means, it means when you have more, in the Falcons case, they went with 6 offensive linemen. Jack Nelson came in at left tackle. Jake Matthews moved to the right side. And so you have 3 offensive linemen on one side of the center and 2 on the other, as opposed to the normal 2 on either side of the center. And the Falcons ran that unbalanced formation 3 times in this game. The first 2 times they were successfully able to convert, including on a QB sneak touchdown to Kirk Cousins. And both outside of the QB sneak, both times they ran it behind Jake and Elijah Wilkinson, successfully were able to do it early in the game, and then were not able to do it later in the game. Now, the QB sneaks, Falcons ran 2 of them in this game, were successful. I believe right now they're 5 of 5 on QB sneaks this season, right? 2 with Felipe Franks and 3 with Kirk Cousins, including 2 in this game. But the Falcons overall have been underwhelming in short yardage throughout this season and in previous years. We'll get to the numbers from the past few years, but according to True Media, they have about a 66% conversion rate on runs on any down with 2 or less yards to go. That ranks 23rd in the NFL. Again, the NFL average is about 70%. And this is not just a 2025 issue. This has been an ongoing issue for years, right? The last time that the Falcons were a good short yardage team was 2019 when they ranked 7th, right? In the 6 years since, if you combine from 2020 to now, they are the worst short yardage rushing team in the entire NFL, even worse than the Miami Dolphins, who are, I believe, second to last, right? And they have finished in the bottom 10 in 5 out of those 6 years, including this year. And the one exception was last season in 2024 when they finished 16th. And as we noted throughout the offseason, when we talked about, when Drew Dalman was healthy, the Falcons were a high value short yardage team. They were 6th in the NFL in short yardage situations when Drew Dalman was on the field last year. But when he was not on the field and Ryan Newsel was on the field at the center position, they dropped to 31st, and that averaged out to be about 16th over the course of the season, given how much each one of those guys played. And so we talked about that being a potential drop-off this year. And fortunately, the Falcons aren't 31st. They're 23rd. So it has been an improvement. And obviously, there was a lot of concern about that specific issue with McGarry going out. And obviously, I think this team would be in a better situation if McGarry was healthy than they are currently. But, part of the reason why the Falcons have struggled so much over the years with their short yardage situations is an over-reliance on zone runs, right? That, they're, instead of going downhill, going north-south, they are often going side to side or east-west, right? And obviously that's a little harder to convert when you just need to get a yard, right? And they don't necessarily really have the horses to run a downhill scheme at this point in time, right? For example, on the 3rd and 1 in the late third quarter, the Falcons tried to run power. They didn't run zone on that particular play. Power is a staple gap run where you pull a guard into the hole. This was a staple run for the Falcons during the height of the Michael Turner years from like 08 to 2010, right? And in this particular instance, they pulled Bergeron into the hole. He didn't hit his assignment. But Allgeier was able to still convert because he was able to basically fall forward to get the 1 yard that they needed on that particular play. And so, when it comes to this Falcons team ability to move guys off the ball, and that play is a good example of it, they typically struggle. And that has consistently been a struggle, not just this year, but for previous years. And when we talk about this offensive line and its future, we've mentioned many times on this podcast that the Falcons are very likely going to have to rebuild this offensive line in the years to come. They are currently, when you look at their 5 starters, right, and this wouldn't change if Caleb McGarry was healthy because he's basically a week younger, I think, than Elijah Wilkinson, right? Is that the Falcons have the 5th oldest active starting 5 in the NFL right now. Averaging about an average age of about 28.8 years, so almost 29 years, right? And obviously that number is going to go up one in a year from now. And when you look at this offensive line, they're going to run it back with the same starting 5, right? Next year, all of these guys are under contract: Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Ryan Uzel, Chris Lindstrom, and Caleb McGarry. But the question is going to be, how many of these guys are going to still be here in 2027, right? And so, Jake and Caleb's guarantees run out after the 26th season. Ryan Uzel and Matthew Bergeron are free agents after the 26th season. So you're really only looking at Chris Lindstrom as the one guy that you can sit there and say with, a high level of confidence that it's still going to be starting games for this team in 2027. Now, again, if I was to place bets, I would probably bet that Jake Matthews would also be starting games. I would be betting at this point in time that the Falcons will probably re-sign Matthew Bergeron because they'll probably be forced to, because they'll need to replace the center and the right tackle, and replacing the left guard on top of that is going to be potentially a hassle for them in the future. But it's really going to be a struggle for this team, to maintain and improve this offensive line, right? It's not just maintaining it, but it's also improving this unit, right? But that's an opportunity that they do have if they make a coaching change, that they can change the identity of this offense and in the near future and shift to maybe more of a downhill gap blocking scheme that can potentially help solve this problem. But if they do that, they are going to need to get different players in the building, because I just don't think there's enough guys right now that you can sit there with confidence and say, oh, that guy can thrive in that scheme. Like McGarry can thrive in that scheme, but again, how much longer is Caleb McGarry going to play, right? I don't think that's really what Chris Lindstrom thrives in, but I think Chris Lindstrom is good enough that he'll be okay, right? We'll see if Bergeron can make that next leap again next year in the contract year, and maybe he can thrive in that scheme, but that's not really a Newsel scheme. That's not really a Jake Matthews scheme. So again, there's a lot of question marks surrounding the future identity of this offensive line. And when you look at the limited assets that the Falcons have right now going into the 2026 offseason, your best case scenario is that maybe you can use a day 2 pick on an offensive tackle, because the premium of that position forces you, if you want a starting caliber offensive tackle, you kind of have to draft that guy. I mean, if you want to plug and play day 1 starter, you got to draft that guy in the first round. But if you can get a quality developmental tackle on day 2, and maybe that guy's ready to start by his second year, right? And then on top of that, if you're looking to upgrade the center spot, you can probably afford to wait till day 3, because typically you can still find quality starting centers on day 3 of the draft, right? But given that this team has so many other needs, across their roster, there's a real possibility that they could wind up punting again on the offensive line, as they have done for arguably 3 of the last 4 years, right, in the draft, right? This past year, they finally drafted Jack Nelson. I know they've drafted other offensive linemen, but, we're not counting Justin Schaefer and Javon Gwynn, are we, people? Or am I crazy if we're not sitting here going like, oh, they drafted those guys not with the intention of those guys being starters? But that's maybe just me. But I could very easily see that, because the Falcons have more pressing needs, right? And this is part of my anti-Terry Fontenot agenda, because the Falcons just don't have enough assets to really address all their issues, right? And, you look at the offensive line, you're like, well, we're not going to need the offensive line until 2027, but we might need a wide receiver. We might need a tight end. We might need a cornerback. We might need a linebacker. We might need a nose tackle in 2026. And those are more pressing issues. And those are the positions that we're going to draft. And we'll just punt on the offensive line and hopefully, make it work and figure it out later. Right. And so that's going to be a potential challenge for this team. But as we've stated many times on this podcast, you have to draft offensive linemen early because it takes typically 3 or 4 years for those guys to develop. And so you need to draft those guys 3 or 4 years before you need them. And if the Falcons need those guys in 27 and 28, my math is, saying that 24 and whatnot should have been the years where the Falcons were drafting those players. But we'll see on that front. And, speaking of the short yardage issues, not to mention, you also potentially could lose Tyler Allgeier to free agency this offseason. And he's been your best short yardage runner this year. He's converted about 68% of his short yardage runs compared to Bijan Robinson, who's only converted about 58% of his runs. And when you look at under center runs, especially if we're talking about a world where the Falcons are much more of an under center offense in the future, which may or may not be the case, but we'll see. The difference in conversion rate is even starker, right? Allgeier is 69%, and Bijan's only 43% on under center runs on short yardage. So there's a real possibility if you lose Allgeier this offseason and you still have the concerns on the offensive line, that your short yardage issues actually could get worse before they actually get better. So that is going to be something that the Falcons are going to have to worry about. But, even if things aren't necessarily looking up in the trenches, they do appear to be looking up in the secondary. And we'll talk about, the Falcons' potential to be in the market for a new CB2 and whether or not CJ Henderson or Kobe Bryant's performance against Arizona makes them possible altered options to land that gig. So when we look at CJ Henderson and Kobe Bryant in this Arizona Cardinals game, they both played. Bryant played, I believe, 24 snaps, Henderson 37 snaps. Based off my charting of this game, Henderson was targeted 2 times in this game, gave up 1 reception, and got an interception, right? The reception was a 14-yard double move by Marvin Harrison Jr. in the fourth quarter, which he got CJ Henderson on that particular play, but obviously and then Henderson also had a missed tackle in this game as well. But obviously Henderson made it up for having the game-sealing interception in the fourth quarter, working against Michael Wilson. Bryant was targeted 3 times and gave up 3 receptions on all 3 of those plays. One was the 32-yard touchdown he gave up to Michael Wilson in the first quarter, where I thought Bryant was in good position, but just kind of got a bad bounce of the ball, where that ball sort of bounced off his arm into Michael Wilson's arms. And so I thought Bryant did a good job contesting that throw, but obviously the result wasn't the way you wanted it to go. But then he gave up a 20-yard blaze out to Michael Wilson at the end of the second quarter and then missed the tackle immediately after that catch. And then I charted him giving up a 2-yard completion to Trey McBride in the fourth quarter. And so when you look at the battle between these two guys, who had the better day, I think CJ Henderson clearly had the better day. And I would imagine that if Mike Hughes does not return this week against the Rams, it'll be Henderson's starting job this week. We'll see if the Rams have Devontae Adams. Sean McVay this past Friday, I believe, said that Adams was unlikely to play against the Falcons in Week 17, but this Monday didn't completely rule it out. So we'll get a better update later in the week on that front. But they split reps against the Cardinals. I imagine they'll split reps again against the Rams, but you'll probably see an even heavier dose of CJ Henderson based off of this performance than we saw against the Cardinals. And I think that's worthwhile. Henderson is a free agent, and will have an opportunity, I think, down the stretch to make a positive impression to potentially land a contract here in Atlanta and be the front runner going into training camp to be the CB2 opposite AJ Terrell. Now, I think cornerback remains a priority need for this team this offseason. I think it's debatable whether cornerback or wide receiver is the team's biggest need. I think the case, for the case against cornerback and for wide receiver being the number one need is just because your alternative options at cornerback are probably better than your alternative options at wide receiver, right? You have potentially CJ Henderson, Mike Hughes, Kobe Bryant, Clark Phillips at cornerback. And if you don't have Darnell Mooney at wide receiver as your wide receiver 2, and currently I'm expecting the Falcons to move on from Darnell Mooney this offseason, you really have nothing at wide receiver after Darnell Mooney as far as viable number 2 options. But because the Falcons have ignored the cornerback position opposite AJ Terrell for so long, for 5+ years now, it does feel like, stopping that revolving door is potentially a long-standing issue, and so therefore arguably a bigger priority. But again, your mileage may vary on cornerback versus wide receiver. Not to mention, I would argue that there's a higher premium at cornerback than there is at wide receiver, meaning that it's harder to find a quality outside starting cornerback after round 2. It's not to say that, you can easily find a starting outside wide receiver in rounds 3 and 4. But it just feels like in general, most years, wide receiver is a little bit deeper of a position at that spot in the middle rounds than cornerback is. Finding a nickel in the middle rounds is much easier, right? But the outside guy is a little bit harder. And then when you look at this upcoming draft class, we'll see how it all goes. But just the initial thoughts is when you look at Dane Brugler of the Athletics top 50 board from November, or you look at PFF's current top 100 big board, they have more wide receivers ranked in those areas than they have cornerbacks, which suggests that this upcoming draft class is going to be a little bit deeper at wide receiver than it is at cornerback. So if you're prioritizing those two spots in the offseason, it would suggest, in the draft at least, suggest that you pull the trigger on the cornerback first, because you're more likely to still be able to get a good wide receiver in round 3 than you would be at the cornerback position. But obviously, still a lot of moving parts when it comes to that. And so these are we're having December conversations for things that really we shouldn't be able to discuss until March and April. But, between now and then, I am planning on going back to the Senior Bowl this year, and this will be my 4th year, if I'm not mistaken, if my math is correct. Yes, 4th year. And this will be the first year that maybe my primary focus will be on the wide receiver and DB number one-on-ones, as opposed to the one-on-ones in the trenches. I'm still going to look at the trench stuff because it's what I like. But, because of where the Falcons' needs are, it's probably, those Senior Bowl wide receivers and DBs are certainly going to be at the front of the mind. So we'll see on that front. But we'll worry about that in January and February when we get to the Senior Bowl down in Mobile. But those are my thoughts on the All-22 guys. Appreciate you. We'll be back tomorrow with a crossover Thursday ahead of Christmas. I'm not planning on doing a show for Friday, so no Jarvis this week. Let that man be with his family rather than doing shenanigans here on the podcast. But if you want to check that out, of course, you can continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, if you are an everydayer of this podcast, give the gift this holiday. If you're last minute shopping and you're like, what do I give myself or my friends and family? Give the gift of the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you can give the gift of a no interruptions version of Locked On Falcons with no ads, Discord access to interact with other Locked On Podcast Network fans, so you can talk trash on Saints fans to your heart's content, as well as merch store and so many other perks as well that you can find at that link in the description, again at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. And if you're curious but you don't want to commit the $5 a month or $50 a year to join the Everydayer Club, you can get a free month by hitting up one of the Locked On Podcast Network social media accounts and tell them why Locked On Falcons is on show them, that Locked On Falcons is on your Spotify Wrapped playlist, and that will get you a code to get a free month of the Everydayer Club. So you can try it out and then, see if you want to, continue to be that leveled up everydayer in 2026. So go check it out again at the link in the description below. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL to get yourself geared up for the rest of the Week 17 action. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.